All right, I want to say hello to everybody and welcome to this presentation. It's titled Misinformation About Science, and I do have an important disclaimer up front. I want to make sure that everybody understands I'm speaking for myself, Alice Krueger. I am not speaking for Virtual Ability, Inc. The information I'm providing today is derived from a document called Understanding and Addressing Misinformation About Science. It is a publication of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. It was put out in, I believe, November of 2024, and it is a consensus study report. The formal citation is there. And you notice there's a link there. You can look up. It's a really long original text. I'm not going to go through the whole thing today. You can get it from that link, or you can request a PDF copy from info@virtualability.org. So I'm going to summarize the 409 pages for you in less than an hour. And I'm going to do it in text and voice for maximum accessibility. And then I'm going to offer you the text of the presentation on a note card when I'm finished, so you can keep it. And I will also pause every once in a while so that you can have a little bit of a group discussion. Now, we all know that misinformation about everything is pervasive. Misinformation may be inconsequential, or it may have various negative impacts. And even our entertainment can contain misinformation. But information that shapes people's perceptions, that informs policies and impacts services, can have very profound and long-lasting effects on individuals, communities, population segments, and society in general. It's actually pretty difficult to define misinformation in science. Science is a process where knowledge claims are tested, and they're either accepted or they become modified as additional knowledge accumulates. So the scientific process is one of continuing revision. Therefore, scientific understanding is incremental, especially in the older, more well-established fields of science like biology and chemistry. Scientists often speak of standing on the shoulders of giants, and that means their work builds on the work of previous experts in their field. But science can also make rapid leaps in new areas of study, and we saw a lot of that during the COVID crisis. The rapid appearance of new knowledge that displaces prior understanding can actually be confusing to non-scientists. They may use this established process of knowledge evolution to question the trustworthiness of science and scientists. Was the prior state of knowledge misinformation? No. It was the best evidence-based knowledge available at that time. I'm going to attempt to define and distinguish three terms: misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. The report that I'm reporting on, yes, that's true, Phil. The report defines misinformation as, quote, information that asserts or implies claims that are inconsistent with the weight of accepted scientific evidence at the time, unquote. Misinformation is disinformation if the disseminator knows it is false. Disinformation may be deliberately created to harm, manipulate, or mislead. Now, not all misinformation is disinformation. Sometimes, quite frequently, the person sharing false information is not aware that it is false. Malinformation is based on fact, and it is used out of context. The purpose of malinformation is to harm, manipulate, or mislead. And tagline says, it seems that one of the vulnerabilities of science in the eyes of lay society is how headlines or potential claims taken from something in the discourse that occurs in scientific communities. Discourse is an important word. If it's taken out of context as a cheap and easy news headline, when it is still in process, being tested, debated, and considered, but gets presented as a fact. Really important. Are these distinctions clear to you? It looks like we are on the same page, yes. Everybody's okay with those three terms? Okay, looks like several people are. All right, we can go on. I'm used to giving references, so I want to warn you, I'm going to offer a number of live links during this presentation, and I'd recommend you click them and bookmark them to review them later. So here's the first one. It's a nice summary about misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, and it comes from the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. And so there's the link. You can click it and review it later. Identification of misinformation about science changes over time as scientific knowledge evolves. This report reminds us that misleading information is not necessarily false. True information can cause inaccurate understanding or false beliefs. It is not a characteristic of the information. Instead, it is a product of the interaction between the information and its recipient. The same fact can be informative to one person and misleading to another, and that's definitely something to ponder. The sources of misinformation about science are quite diverse. Misinformation can originate in many types of media. Some sources of science misinformation, disinformation, and misleading information include corporations, governments and politicians, non-governmental organizations, science organizations and institutions, alternate health and science industries, news media organizations and institutional press offices, entertainment media, and individuals, both scientists and non-scientists. This report makes 3 recommendations to eliminate the sources of misinformation. To curb science misinformation, misinformation should be actively countered. Press releases should be confirmed by researchers. Public communicators of science should be well informed. You're right, Sumo. Defining information is very tricky. Specifically, the context of research results, which means their limitations and the weight of evidence, should be clearly provided when you're communicating. Science, medical, and health professionals who are public communicators, like the ones shown on this slide, should receive training and support from professional communicators. Science communicators should use evidence-based strategies, including context, interpretations, and caveats of scientific research results. Factors supporting the spread of misinformation include multiple rapid channels of information, reduced journalism funding, that one that you may not have thought of, motivations and incentives, and crises and social mistrust. And yes, tagline, you're correct. Sometimes it's done for political purposes. Coverage of science has been reduced and is covered by journalists who have no expertise in science. And of course, that causes inaccuracies. The volume, production, speed, and spread of information may detach information from its context. Search algorithms constrain information offered to individuals, and content on social media is not well moderated. Crises increase both interest and uncertainty in the information-consuming public. So here's another reference you may want to bookmark for later. It's called How Social Media Rewards Misinformation, and it comes from Yale. I found that to be a very interesting article. Misinformation flows rapidly through numerous communication channels. Misinformation spread is facilitated by online platform features offering incentives, motivations, and strategies for easier spread. Societal factors are involved, like crises and mistrust, and the changes in journalism for more but less accurate science news. The report makes 6 recommendations on how to halt the spread of misinformation. Create an independent agency to curate high-quality science information. You might think that would be peer-reviewed journals. I'm not sure that's true. Online platforms should promote valid information. I'm definitely sure that's not true. Promote sharing between scientists and journalists. Train professional communicators in data literacy and reasoning. Build and maintain preparedness capacity to communicate science. Document the origin and spread and impact of misinformation. Misinformation can have a lot of different impacts. It can hinder informed decision-making. We see that fairly often. It can exacerbate existing harms. It can definitely diminish trust in public institutions, and it can create and/or reinforce stereotypes. Misinformation can lead to harmful decisions at all levels, from the individual to the governmental. It can result in behaviors that have negative consequences. If the misinformation distorts public opinion and limits productive debate, misinformation can threaten the health of a democratic system. If misinformation is about specific population groups or communities, this can lead to bias and harmful false narratives, and that contributes to additional inequalities. The report makes a couple of recommendations of how to deal with the impacts of misinformation. Community-based organizations should build community resilience against misinformation. And efforts to combat misinformation must be tailored for specific audiences. Science information voids that are specific to particular communities must be identified and targeted by strategies developed to address them. Common misinformation should be pre-bunked. That's a term they use in the report. And education about manipulation of information should be made widely available. Don't you just love that term, pre-bunking? Debunking of misinformation should include explanations of why it is false and of the motivation of those spreading it. Yeah, I think I agree with you, Roy. The recommender systems made this worse. Pre-bunk before disaster. Interventions to address misinformation may attempt to disrupt the supply, the demand, the distribution, and or the uptake of misinformation, those four things. Supply-based interventions reduce the amount of circulating misinformation or improve the quality of circulating information. Demand-based interventions act to reduce the consumption of misinformation. Distribution-based interventions limit the spread of misinformation. And uptake-based interventions reduce the effects of misinformation on beliefs or behaviors. Community, state, and national organizations should use effective approaches to addressing misinformation about science. And this report makes a couple of recommendations related to interventions to address misinformation. Community organizations should provide high-quality, timely, culturally relevant, and accurately translated science information. There's a lot packed into that sentence. Those are really important, and they're difficult points. Second, all organizations should pre-bunk and debunk common false themes and narratives. False statements should be clarified, and the motivation for spreading false information should be explained. Again, that's really important, and it's difficult. Just a little aside here, this image on this slide is Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. You may not be familiar with that. It's one I like. What it does is it shows 6 concentric circles. The innermost one is the individual, and it goes outward through the exoskeleton. That's his term for it, which means local governments and mass media and that kind of thing. And then it goes further out to the macro system, which are social norms and political systems. And then the last ring is the chronosystem, or time. And that's where that image is from, if you want to find out more about it. Many strategies related to dealing with science misinformation address individuals, when systems-level actions really are necessary. Yet there's been little research on misinformation mitigation at higher organizational levels. Focusing on individual change puts the burden of mitigation on individuals rather than on larger systems. Is that fair? Is it reasonable? It also makes individual action seem to be the most effective way to address misinformation, and that's not necessarily true. System-level strategies have not been adequately evaluated for efficacy, and this is often due to funding priorities. What do you think? Where does the power lie to change the impact of science misinformation? And I'm going to pause here. You can respond to that about where you think the power lies. I'm going to remind you I'm a little over halfway through what I wanted to share. Stephen says early education and in the school systems have the power to impact misinformation. Taliver says grassroots movements by individuals. Tagline says questionable if the individuals who want to address disinformation are not in positions of authority or in the media with a voice that is heard. Stephen says at least to build resilience. Suji says schools need to better teach reasoning skills. Gus says education. Critical thinking would be a clear antivirus for misinformation. Syzygy says that will combat misinformation. Roy says credibility analysis taught in school along with search engines pushing up credible sources over the ones that have the best SEO optimized or recommended based on past searches or videos you watched. Taliver says chain of custody for information passing. History of the origin of the info. Yeah, we often don't know that, do we? Sumo says an increased focus on what networks benefit from missing information and then revealing those networks. Mike says science literacy and critical thinking skills are hard to push. U.S. society is hostile to perceived intellectualism. Syzygy says Mike makes a good point. There needs to be a push to make intellectualism cool again. Phoenix says she thinks anti-intellectualism surely is a hurdle. Stephen says Bill Maher and Neil deGrasse Tyson are not enough. Radron says people should be able to think for themselves, speak and be wrong. That is how they learn. That's sort of the nature of science. Max suggests sneaking it in through children's books. Tagline says we are all threatened by the rabble who see conspiracy theories or religious basis for everything. The populist politicians who speak at the level of 8-year-olds and belittle people or speak meanly appeal to the half of the population that is on the lower end in terms of intellectual processing, curiosity, and memory, and being informed objectively about the world. Roy says at the same time he doesn't think we should put limits on free speech. He's undecided on this because at one time everyone thought the world was flat and they killed people when they said it was round. Saying the world was round was considered disinformation back then. Again, this is the nature of science. Sumo says, look, just read Harare's book Nexus, convinced it has a lot to do with networks. What does the info do for which groups? Whom does it connect? Because you're right, communication is a matter of connection. Mike agrees that free speech is important, respect for discourse is important, but also being open to changing opinions based on facts. Sumo says this doesn't say what to do about it. That's one of the things I like about this report. They report issues and then they say, here's some things we should do about them. Tagline says the round earth argument is part of the marketplace of ideas, but nowadays we have nefarious players with resources systematically exploiting unrestricted, unvetted, quote-unquote free speech in order to achieve political goals and impose their agenda on others unwittingly. Unwittingly on the term of the others, not the imposers, I'm assuming you mean. And Sumo's agreeing. Phoenix, I'm not sure I understand that. You thought that the Trump-Zelensky meeting was an opening? Radwin says there are no true facts. Example, maps prove the reality of a flat Earth. Oh, boys love. Tagline says those imposing the disinformation are very cognizant of what they are doing and the intended subversive outcome. Syzygy says facts are true by definition. Fact equals true information. An English definition. Sumo says, but doesn't what is true depend on your perspective? Tagline says it is a machine fueled and lubricated by vast quantities of money without accountability. I think maybe it is time to move on. You're welcome to keep adding information here. Radwin says fact is true in context. So the report concludes that research needs to be directed at system-level strategies to address science misinformation. And they make a recommendation related to scale and efficacy of mitigation strategies. Most of the research on the effects of strategies to address science information has been done at the individual, personal level. We need to better understand the impacts of misinformation and the capabilities of strategies to refute it within communities, platforms, policy, and regulating systems. Syzygy says fact is true according to English definitions. The question is whether something is a fact or not the meaning of the word fact. And Tagline says one's best chance in a conflict is during that period, if it exists, when one's opponent is unaware that a war is ongoing. Understanding how individual and structural factors interact to spread misinformation and influence its impact could aid in the design of effective and efficient pre-bunking and debunking strategies. The report states that the impact of misinformation on underserved groups and the effectiveness of mitigation strategies has not been well documented. Mike reminds us that one goal of science is to provide a common context in which data can be interpreted to determine what is fact and what is not. Underserved groups are often excluded from research projects. Inconsistent rules about data privacy across social media platforms hinder research on their impact on the spread of misinformation. In order for research results to support establishment of fair policies, researchers need better access to consistent data. And the report actually makes a recommendation related to obtaining good quality data about science misinformation on social media platforms. Social media companies and researchers need to collaborate to improve the current situation. Social media companies and researchers must improve their working relationships. Social media companies should not charge for access to their data. Researchers need to stay independent of the companies they're researching. Is science misinformation a new phenomenon? What do you think? Sumo says science misinformation is as old as science. Max gives the example of phlogiston. And Gus says the Earth is the center of the universe. Taru is not agreeing with that, I suspect. Suzuki says, I think such misinformation is very old, like Sumo said. So is everybody feeling the same about this? It flows faster. Stephen says, look for citations to reliable sources. Phil says, older than the oldest stories about how things work, if you're talking about science as what we know. Syzygy says, sometimes it's not clear which resources are reliable and which are not. That's a problem. Roy says, funding always has had influence. Now they often write conflict of interest section on papers, so that's good. Now that's something that has been added recently, and I think it's a valid and valuable piece of information. Okay, let's continue on. Of course, science misinformation isn't new. This problem's been around for at least 3 centuries. And I love this cartoon. It actually comes from the Anti-Vaccine Society back in 1802. And there was both misinformation and disinformation spread about the smallpox vaccine. And Phoenix says she's heard that in history you have to have 2 or more evidences needed for a citation. Just a little reminder, historical reminder, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration was created in 1906, and its purpose was to combat widespread misinformation about the safety and effectiveness of drugs, food additives, and other products. Tagline says, the increasing gap in wealth makes it all the easier for a very few with vast wealth to buy off most anyone else for some selfish, nefarious, or self-serving personal goals by the lucky few. This is a consequence of such disparity that slush funds, a crumb from King James' table, seems like unimaginable wealth to the ordinary person of ordinary means. And Phil is trying to sell us some snake oil. The FDA probably wouldn't approve. Vitamin A and cod liver oil. So here's the website of the FDA. It was still up last I looked. I had the horrible problem at the beginning of this month when I put up some new poster sets on Health Info Island that some of the references that I had included were gone. So it's important to consider who is most likely to believe misinformation about science. And actually, anybody has the potential to believe misinformation. Even you and even me. People are most likely to believe science misinformation that aligns with their values and existing worldview. And I think we all believe that. Anyone who's purchased Phil's snake oil. They're more likely to believe misinformation that is from a source they trust. And the thing is, we don't all trust the same sources. They're more likely to believe if it's repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated. And additionally, they're more likely to believe something that's on a topic for which they don't have strong pre-existing beliefs and attitudes. That may surprise you. Of course, basic science literacy is important, but that does not prevent a person from believing misinformation. Sociocultural factors influence the science information and misinformation that people are exposed to. We don't all get the same information or misinformation on any particular topic. Oh, clotted cream. And many other factors influence the actions that an individual will take based on the information or misinformation that they receive. Why do you think science misinformation may be problematic? Syzygy says it's like the more general question of who was most likely to be scammed, and apparently anyone can be scammed, right? That's unfortunate but true. Why is science misinformation so problematic? It can affect lives, like anti-vaccine. And also, Sumo says, very realistic, how about the measles issue now and anti-vax information? Roy says, for the individual, like if they believe the earth is flat, I don't think it's that bad. But when policymakers make policy out of disinformation, then people can die of measles. And Taliber says, because it usually is adjusting of reality. Tagline says, one of the problems is that getting dry objective facts into people's head requires receptivity and takes time for the individual to digest and internalize. On the other hand, emotionally inflammatory sound bites go straight to the reptilian brain, if you all know what that is. That is what science education is having to compete with. And Syzygy says, measles is coming back because of misinformation. Stephen says, in many cases when misinformation is being peddled, the complexity of science makes it hard to debunk, and many headlines can be quite misleading by bypassing the complexity. Phoenix, you're reading about measles, too. Okay, moving on. Sam says it may be a new strand of measles. I don't believe that it is. I haven't read that it was. Syzygy read a book on how junk science is peddled in courtrooms to facilitate easy judgments. There's an example of a distinctive misuse. Phil says measles is not coming back, but groups of susceptible people can get it if the local populace is under-vaccinated. Sumo says, if fear is a controlling factor, the task is to allay fear. Laugh, tough to do for the lizard brain. Gus said, getting facts into people's heads. Offer doesn't tell. Show doesn't coerce. Pretty standard psychology. Stop telling me what to do and believe is pretty universal. Sand says, fear tactic, get vaccines for nothing. Roy says, the scientific process is very rigorous and sometimes doesn't have answers. That's where the snake oil salesmen come in with false hope, like people who are desperate with chronic illness or cancer when science doesn't have a solution. Dolly says, think the underlying problem is a lack of critical thinking. All follows from that. 2 decades ago, Sumo says, we thought measles had been eradicated in the U.S. Gus is agreeing. Tagline says, even advanced mathematics is so developed and subspecialized that it can be daunting to make sense of a paper in a given discipline unless you have, this is true, unless you have devoted lots of time and effort in that area of interest. Generally, there is so much information out there that we are all really in future shock since at least yesterday. Radwan says, most misinformation during the pandemic is now knowledge. Stephen says, fingerprinting is a good example. There never was confirmatory science that all fingerprints could be categorized as unique when tested versus a database of real samples, but it is accepted for a long time. And Syzygy says, vaccines are given by medical professionals following proper guidelines. The problem is that misunderstanding science causes misunderstanding of the world. Misunderstanding the world misaligns individual, community, and governmental choices and preferences. Gus wants to take a quick poll. Should pharmacists be allowed to give vaccines? Yes or no? Just type Y or N. I think people are agreeing that pharmacists have the professional capacity to do that. Phil says 98.6 degrees was accepted as the normal body temperature for a long time until further studies were conducted. Roy says, like, we don't know why autism rates increased, but many children get diagnosed right after getting their childhood vaccines. Science doesn't have an answer, so then people may misattribute correlation to causation. That's a big problem. It gives some answer when science is saying, I don't know. Misinformation about science can undermine trust in important societal institutions. Tagline says, at one point, there was a chance for humankind to eradicate tuberculosis. We were quite close, but then we got slacked off and cut funding and attention with public health measures, even on a global basis. Now, accelerated earlier by AIDS, drug-resistant tuberculosis is continually on the rise. Alexander the Great always pursued his enemies to their utter destruction, and actually it almost always seems a mistake not to finish things off. Gus says lower than 98.6 body temperature appears to correlate with being overweight, ? Mike says he got his flu vaccines from students in the Doctor of Pharmaceutical Practice program at his school under the supervision of their teachers and an RN. Pharmacists are trained individuals, that is true. Misinformation about science is a multifaceted, complex phenomenon, and all of us have important roles in addressing it. In order to develop informed policy responses and help individuals and communities combat the potential negative effects of science misinformation, we need to know a lot more. We must examine what we assume about the origins of the misinformation, about how and why it spreads, and about how we can mitigate its negative effects. We do not yet know enough about the dynamics of science misinformation. For example, we know little about how misinformation is shared within and affects different local communities, especially communities of underserved people and socially vulnerable groups. Emiliak says, it boils down to recognizing or not the value of scientific method, which is falsifiable by the same people applying it, contrary to faiths. You cannot win a debate with those not accepting scientific method and instead trusting snake oil salesmen. Paradoxically, those same people believe in occult conspiracies by the scientific community. We don't know enough about misinformation that travels through offline social networks. We don't know enough about misinformation that goes through older forms of media, like newspapers and television, rather than online media. Tagline says pharmacies and public health departments are still a very important place to seek help with health issues for those who cannot find a doctor quickly or are afraid of generating an overwhelming debt by going to an emergency facility. Roy says there are those who don't have proper health insurance, and Mike says he always erases his pentagrams after doing science. So there's a lot of work to be done yet in this area. I encourage you all to go forth and combat science misinformation wherever you notice it. Pre-bunk as much as you can. If you will click on the box that I'm about to put down, I can find it in my inventory, you will get a note card of the text that I'm sharing today. Let me get that out. There we go, it's right in front of the slides. And Syzygy says, of course, due to scientific advances, you're supposed to be using hexagrams now. Good. Robin says, science should be natural philosophy again, since speculation trumps knowledge. And Mike forgot the metric conversion. So, had heard about triangles. That's definitely misinformation. Tagline says, still, it seems some people are simply not worth discussing. They're not worth discussing with them some of these issues. It can be a total waste of time. You may wish to save the chat also so that you can see all the additional information that our Science Center friends have shared as well. So I want to thank everybody for their attention and input. And I think that's the end of today, other than the discussion that you want to have. Syzygy says, not sure that speculation trumps knowledge. Both are useful, especially if you can verify the latter.